Thank you, Dr. Woodworth, and I really want to give a huge thank you to New Fashion Pork because they're a great industry partner on this trial that we did, and I think it brings true value to the industry to be able to conduct this type of research and this amount of sows in a commercial setting, so very appreciative to their support of this project. But how this whole project stemmed was really that Peter Thiel's work that showed as you moved that time from when a sow last consumed a meal closer to when she farrowed, they saw a reduction in that farrowing duration and hopefully an improvement in that stillborn rate. And so we really wanted to test, can we apply that today in a commercial setting here in the United States and see that same result? And so high level here, what we did is we had 3 different treatments represented, and I'll show those on the next slide, but we captured close to 250 sows per treatment. You can see there the total born and the born alive in this particular production setting. We had a crew there 24/7 around the clock there at the farm, so it took a huge effort, but we were able to capture when all of those sows started farrowing and also measure when all of those pigs finished coming out. And so we do have a true farrowing duration, a birth interval. We collected birth weights and wean weights and colostrum intake, and so there's a large body of data here, and I'll share kind of how the different treatments interacted. So very simple, what we did is we had a 2.7 kilogram meal as our control, so 6 pounds once a day in the morning that those sows would receive. Or we took that same 6 pounds and broke it up into 4 evenly spaced, evenly amount meals throughout the day. So 7 a.m., 1 p.m., 7 p.m., 1 a.m. And these are hand fed, so it wasn't a system, it was us going in and feeding them. So I know that there's some practicality of getting that implemented, but that's how we did it today in this study. And then at that same time period, we had a third treatment where we had those sows being fed ad libitum, but we would get them up every 6 hours to encourage them to consume a meal as well. So it wasn't just feed being in front of them, we did encourage them to eat another meal. So how did that end up in us getting a meal closer to when she started farrowing? If you look at that graph on the left there, what you can see is that in the gray bar, those are the ones that had the meal once a day. And so on average, it's 600 minutes or about 10 hours from when she last ate a meal to when she started farrowing. But when we split that up and every 6 hours she's receiving a meal, we narrowed that window down to she had consumed a meal in less than about 4 hours. So indeed, our treatments were working, so it made sense in that regard. But as we looked at farrowing duration, which was one of our key metrics in terms of how can we shorten that farrowing duration, we weren't able to pick up any difference there. And one of the things here that's interesting is Peter Thiel's study really was closer to like a 5.5 hour on average farrowing duration. And you look at this production setting, maybe it was a combination of the total born and us having so much farrowing assistance that farrowing duration really was under 4 hours in general here. So maybe that's one thing to keep in mind with this study. Now, one of the interesting outcomes for us, indeed, was the farrowing assistance. And so if you look at this, we physically wrote down every time a sow was sleeved and how many pigs out of that litter were physically assisted out. And so what we did see here was that those sows that had been fed ad libitum prior to farrowing required more farrowing assistance compared to either of the other 2 treatments, with those that had been fed every 6 hours having the least farrowing assistance required. Now, if you look at that stillborn rate over there on the graph there on the right, what we didn't see, though, was a difference statistically in terms of stillborn rate. And I think part of that might be due to the fact that we did have so much farrowing assistance. We had people 24/7 there in the farm. And so I think maybe farrowing assistance is a better indication that if you don't have 24/7 care, maybe what your outcome could be expected with using these treatments in farm. Now, how did this translate into differences in sow feed intake? We didn't observe anything statistically, but we do see numerically that those sows that had been fed ad libitum prior to farrowing did consume more feed on average during that lactation period. And when we calculate out the total feed consumed from the time she entered that farrowing crate until when she left the farrowing house, those sows that had been fed ad libitum obviously were consuming more feed in that pre-farrow period, which is largely what drove their total lactation feed intake up higher. Now, another thing that we measured was the sow body weight and back fat change from when they entered the farrowing house until when they exited the farrowing house. And what we did see here, which I think is largely driven off of the lactation feed intake, is the fact that those sows that were fed ad libitum prior to farrowing did lose less body weight and less back fat as a result. Interestingly, we did pick up a difference in birth weight and piglet performance, and I don't think that's something we would have expected from the study, and maybe it could be a little bit of noise, but we did see a higher birth weight in those pigs that had been fed, or from the sows that had been fed a small meal every 6 hours prior to farrowing compared to our control sows. But when we look at piglet weaning weight here, I think, again, largely driven off of the differences that were observed numerically in lactation feed intake, you see that those pigs from litters of sows that had been fed ad libitum prior to farrowing did wean heavier compared to those that had only received one single meal a day prior to farrowing. But we're all here to talk about survivability, and I know one piece of that was the stillborn rate, which we weren't able to change. But in this particular study, we looked at our mortality and our fall behind pigs. And so one limitation of the study is that the farrowing house was under McRubble at the time, so all those pigs that were born to that sow had to stay on the sow. And so we tracked both mortality and fall behind pigs, and we did see that both the mortality and fall behinds were increased in those females that had only been fed a single meal daily prior to farrowing compared to those other two treatments, either more frequent meals or being fed ad libitum prior to farrowing. And then if we flip it and look at the percentage of pigs of those that were born alive that made it to weaning in this particular study, we did see that those that had evenly spaced meals prior to farrowing had an increased survivability compared to those that had only received one single meal prior to farrowing, with our ad libitum sows being intermediate there. And so I think in summary here, I know a lot of information in a short amount of time, but the frequency of meal prior to farrowing, at least in this study, we weren't able to impact farrowing duration. But we did see that improvement in farrowing assistance. So we didn't need as much assistance in those sows that had a meal more often during that pre-farrow period. We did see that ad libitum feed intake prior to farrowing was beneficial in terms of reducing sow body weight and back fat loss, but you have to take into account how that's going to impact farrowing assistance. And so, again, overall, I think something that we need to continue to monitor as we start pushing more total born and having longer farrowing durations and less assistance in the farrowing house, but a very interesting study to take part in my PhD. So thank you.